Okay, now we come to the book of Judges. A little bit about the book of the Judges. The book of Judges shows a cycle. The Israelites have conquered the land of Canaan. It is now the country of Israel. God had told them not to intermingle or be friends with any of the Canaanite peoples or anybody else of their neighbors, the Moabites, Ammonites, and them, to stay by themselves. But they do, they make friends with these people, and ultimately they start um, worshiping their gods and making idols and building high places to their gods, which of course makes God mad. And when they do this, God sends somebody after them, and they beat up on the Israelites. The Israelites, they repent and they call out to God for help, and God sends them a judge to get them out of trouble. There was no king in Israel at that time. And this cycle repeats throughout the book of Judges. Chapter 1 is kind of a recap of the book of Joshua. It talks about how Jerusalem is captured and how they had captured the other cities. Chapter 2, this is where God rebukes Israel for making friends with the neighbors in the Canaanites. This also, chapter 2 is where recaps where Joshua dies, and Israel starts to serve the Baals. The Baals were some of their Canaanite god. The Baal was the head Canaanite god, the god of thunder. Chapter 3 talks about how idolatry leads to servitude. And chapter 4 is about two of the judges, Deborah and Barak, and how the Israelites they're making idols and worshiping their gods, and they get in trouble, and God punishes them, and Israel repents and calls out to God for help, and he sends them. This chapter 4 is about Deborah and Barak and how they deliver them from the Canaanites. Chapter 5 is about the song of Deborah and Barak. They wrote a song after they were able to get the Israelites out of trouble. Chapter 6, Israelite is oppressed by the country of Midian. And this is the story of Gideon. Gideon is one of the more famous of the judges. And it tells the story of Gideon. The altar of Baal is destroyed. It talks about the sign of the fleece. And Gideon's 300 chosen men. And then we get to chapter 8. We see Zebah and the Zulamite rout. Chapter 9 talks about Abimelech's conspiracy. That's a good story. We get to chapter 10, and we see that the Israelites had made God mad again, mixing with their neighbors like he told them not to. And chapter 10 talks about the oppression of the Philistines and the Ammonites. And chapter 11, we see Japheth, the ninth judge. And this talks about Japheth's tragic vow. That part of the story is very sad. And 12, we see about Japheth and his successors. Okay, chapter 13 is an introduction to the story of the judge Samson. Samson is probably the most famous judge of them all. They made a lot of movies and stuff about him. 13 starts out as the Philistines oppress the Israelites again. Of course, they did evil in the eyes of God, and God sent the Philistines after them to beat up on them, and they cried out for help. They repented, and now God is sending Samson. 14 talks about Samson's marriage, and Samson has a riddle, pretty cool. 15 talks about Samson burns down the Philistine crops. We find out about Samson's weakness. We find out that, of course, Samson's strength is in his hair. And chapter 17 is about Micah's idolatry. 18, the Danites seek territory. At 19, a Levite concubine is degraded. They, of course, the Levites were the priestly tribe. 20 is resolved to punish the guilty. And then there's a civil war, kind of a prelude. And we have a civil war, and Benjamin is defeated. And mourning the lost tribe. And of course, we see at this point too the death of Samson. Because of his wife Delilah, who was a Philistine, she finds out his secret, and they cut his hair, and the Philistines are able to capture him, and they put out his eyes and torture him. And they're at the end, he's lost his strength. The Philistines chain him up to these two pillars in this big building that all these Philistines are in. And Samson calls out to God to give him strength one more time, and God does. And Samson pushes the pillars apart, and of course, the roof comes caving down on the big building, comes caving down on it, and pretty much kills them all. Kind of sad for Samson, but God had got his point across. Okay, this brings us to the end of the book of Judges, that period of time that the judges were ruling. There was no king in Israel at the time. Once again, they had conquered the promised land. The land of Canaan was now Israel. God had told them not to get mixed up with their neighbors, but the Israelites ultimately did, and they would start worshiping their gods, and they would start building idols and high places, which of course would make God mad, and he would send somebody to oppress them, and then the Israelites would repent and call out for help, and God would send them a judge. And this was a cycle shown all the way through the book of Judges. So I'll take a little recap of the book of Judges. There were 13 judges during this period of time. The first one was Othniel, and the oppressors were Cushan, Rashem, the king of Mesopotamia. They oppressed Israel for 8 years, and then they had 40 years of peace and rest. The second judge was Ehud, Eglon, king of Moab, and the Ammonites and the Amalekites were the ones who oppressed Israel. And they oppressed Israel for 18 years, but after Ehud got them out of trouble, they had 80 years of peace and rest. They were behaving themselves. Third judge was Shamgar. The Philistines were the oppressors, but we're not too sure about the periods of oppression and the periods of rest there. Fourth judges were Deborah and Barak. The oppressors were Jabin, the king of Canaan, and he was one of the kings of Canaan, and he oppressed them for 20 years, and then after Deborah and Barak got them out of trouble, they had peace and rest for 40 years. Fifth judge was Gideon. It was the Midianites and the Amalekites, and they oppressed Israel for 7 years until Gideon gets them out of trouble, and they have rest and peace for 40 years. Abimelech is during the time they had a little bit of a civil war. It's not the civil war that split the country, that came much later, but Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. The seventh judge was Tola. He judged Israel for 23 years. Jair judged Israel for 22 years. Japheth, the oppressors were the Philistines and the Ammonites, and he judged Israel for 6 years. They had been oppressed by the Philistines and Ammonites for 18 years. Abez was the 10th judge, and he judged Israel for 7 years. Elon judged Israel for 10 years. Abdon judged Israel for 8 years, and as we just saw, Samson was the oppressors were the Philistines, and he had oppressed them for 40 years. And Samson, after he got him out of trouble, he judged Israel for 20 years after that. And like I said, there was no king in Israel at this period of time. It wasn't until we see first king in the first book of Samuel, which we'll get to in a little bit, But first we have to take a look at the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is one of my most favorite books of the Bible.